All right, everyone, good afternoon, and welcome to today's JLR Daily Fantasy Sports and Sports Betting Podcast. My name is TJ Rowley, and today I'm going to be giving a breakdown of the NFL Conference Championship slate. Before I do jump in, I want to give a shout out to a couple buddies of mine, Joe Joselevich and Len Martin. If you guys have seen already, they've been giving some breakdowns of how they like to do some of their betting within the NBA world from both yesterday and today's slate. So if you haven't watched their video, please go out to YouTube, give it a click, and let us know your feedback. Before I do jump in today, I just want to give a little bit of background on myself. Really into the daily fantasy aspect of the fantasy football action. Jumped in a little bit to some of the sports betting this year with regards to player props and line betting. Did okay for myself, but really the meat and potatoes of what I like to do is within the daily fantasy realm. So before we dive into this week's action, how did we get here? So before I begin, I'll say right now, what I really like to bet on is the 50-50 cash lineups. But right, 2 games on the slate today, that's a GPP tournament all the way. That's really how you have to think about this. As the field narrows week after week, the line between winning and losing gets thinner and thinner. In the first week of the playoffs, we put the barrel to the bat, knocked it out of the park. Last week, we made some solid contact, came up short in our trip around the bases, to use some baseball terminology. Anyone that is a big baseball guy and wants to join the JLR team, give us a shout out as well. But anyway, as I've said many times during the DFS NFL season, particularly in the postseason over the years, you need to be perfect in the playoffs, and unfortunately, perfection was not had last week. We made some really good calls in the divisional round. Just looking at my notes here, we've identified Cooper Kupp, Clyde Edwards-Helaire, Sammy Watkins. We're all not going to play, so that was pivotal. Knowing that Van Jefferson, Darrell Williams, Mecole Hardman were some of those players that were going to step up into those roles was huge. But again, not knowing that Rams defensive end Aaron Donald would be limited, or the Browns running back Kareem Hunt would play less than he has all season, definitely hurt our chances. Still, I think the core of most of our lineups were solid. Cam Akers posted the second most fantasy points of all running backs last week and got us started hot on Saturday. J.K. Dobbins failed to get in the end zone for the 8th straight game, but still posted the 6th most fantasy points among running backs. Again, I was very well positioned going into Sunday's games. Even halfway through the Chiefs game, we were closing in on another big weekend. Then Patrick Mahomes left the game concussed, which really hurt Travis Kelce and Mecole Hardman. And then everything was still good even going into that final game of the weekend between the Saints and the Bucs. We were in the money with Michael Thomas and my number one lock play of the week last week, Antonio Brown. Unfortunately, that's where it went downhill from there. Brown left the game with a knee injury. Thomas had 3 catches called back, including a 7-yard TD before posting a 0. Our main lineup missed cashing by an average of 2.6 points, including 0.9 in our most expensive contest. So, what are you going to say? Welcome to the playoffs. But anyway, now that we're here, just 4 teams remain, 2 games for us to break down. Thus, we really have to get both of these game flows correct and make sure real bold calls are in order to gain an advantage over our opponents. This is, how you train for some of these smaller slates. So, see how we do. But again, by now, I think the first thing we want to start off with is, we know the strengths and weaknesses of all 4 teams that are left in these playoffs. Packers can't stop the run. Neither can the Chiefs or the Bills. Tampa Bay has real trouble in the secondary, which presents a matchup advantage for Aaron Rodgers and the Packers passing offense. So what I'd like to do just going in is just give you a little bit of a synopsis of how I want to operate with these breakdowns. We'll start off with the Packs and Bucks game. We'll talk injuries, matchups to exploit, and then who I believe are the best plays. Then we'll do the same for the Bills and Chiefs. Give a position-by-position breakdown of who are going to be my go-to guys in my daily lineups. Calling out some contrarian plays as well if you want to get a little interesting. And then lastly, I'm going to give you a few of my lineup builds that you'll be seeing more readily within this week's action, at least from my standpoint. So let's give it a go. So the first game that we have today is going to be the Tampa Bay Buccaneers at the Green Bay Packers. That's at 3:05 p.m. Eastern Time, which is going to be coming up here at the top of the hour. The spread was Packers -4, and the point total was around 51.5. Just quickly to go through some injuries on the Bucs side. Antonio Brown, wide receiver, is out with a knee injury. Antone Winfield, the safety, is also questionable with an ankle injury. Packers, Kingsley Keke, defensive end, concussion, he's out. Kevin King, cornerback, is questionable with a back injury. Before I proceed, I want to let you know, injuries are a big thing that you want to be careful with when we're talking about daily fantasy sports. We know we need to be careful with our quarterbacks, our wide receivers, our running backs, tight ends, but what's lost is those guys in the trenches, right? If you're going to lose an Aaron Donald like we did last week in the Rams game, unfortunately, that run defense, that pressure on the quarterback is now gone. So you definitely need to make sure you're adjusting for those types of injuries. But anyway, next piece that I'd like to talk about is what are those matchups that we want to exploit in the Bucs-Packers game. So let's start with the Bucs. When these two teams played Week 6 in Tampa, the Packers stormed out to a 10-0 lead before the Tampa Bay defense took over for the rest of the game. 5 sacks, 2 interceptions later, including a pick 6 by Jamel Dean, the Bucs offense was able to sit on the ball and run it right over the Packers defense. While it's unlikely that Aaron Rodgers plays this poorly again, the Bucs will want to get out to an early lead and use their dual running backs, led by Leonard Fournette and Ronald Jones, to slay the Dragon at Lambeau Field, right? Fournette and Jones combined for 28 rushes, 155 yards, and 2 touchdowns the last time out, while Brady worked the middle of the field, targeting Gronk, Chris Godwin, a combined 15 times. Listen, Tom Brady is too savvy to attack Packers cornerback Jair Alexander, who's arguably the best cornerback in the league right now. And he's likely not going to be shadowing Mike Evans this time around. This makes it difficult to handicap which wide receivers will have the softer coverage. But I think this is actually going to be a great spot to get a little bit weird and have a little bit of difference with some of your daily fantasy builds. The reason why I say that, again, Antonio Brown is out for this game. So where I'm really zoning in on for this game is going to be at that third wide receiver spot. You have Tyler Johnson or Scotty Miller, both of whom are capable of a game-turning big play. So keep that in mind later when we talk about some of our best picks. Next, we're going to talk about the Packers. The Packers just don't want to utilize Aaron Jones nearly as much as they should. But this is going to be a spot for him. The Bucs are tough against the run, but do surrender 4.8 yards per attempt outside the tackles, which is where Jones is dangerous. Game flow will have a lot to do with Green Bay's offense, but the certainty here is that connection between Aaron Rodgers and Davante Adams. Adams received 10 targets the last time these two teams met, but only caught 6 balls for 61 yards. At that point in time, Carlton Davis was playing at a super high level, but his play, I would say, has deteriorated pretty good down the stretch. The other thing to watch out here is whether Buccaneers defensive tackle Vita Vea plays or not. Vea is a landmass in the middle of the Tampa Bay defensive line and would force Green Bay's offense elsewhere. So who am I calling out for the best plays as far as this particular game? I'm going to give you 5. And as always, again, this is for FanDuel, this is for DraftKings. I like to reside in that DraftKings realm. That's kind of where I like the pricing. Davante Adams, number 1. Going to be pricey, but he is your number 1 lock, at least for this game. Aaron Rodgers is going to feed him the ball. They are not going to go away from that. That's got them here. That's how they're going to move on. Next is actually going to be Ronald Jones. He was hurt in the divisional round. No one knew about him coming out and not really playing many snaps. He came back last week and came back into the mold. You saw Leonard Fournette take a backseat a little bit once Ronald Jones came back into play. So Ronald Jones, I think, is going to be the key here. If the Bucs want to win, they're going to have to play great defense and they're going to have to control the ball with the run. Next, Chris Godwin. Love Chris Godwin. I had him last year on a bunch of my fantasy football teams. Was a little bit disappointing this year, thinking that you loved how Tom Brady used your players in the slot. This is going to be another opportunity to have Chris Godwin kind of reenact Julian Edelman in Tampa Bay. Not to say he didn't have a great year, but he dealt with some injuries. And then also there's a lot of mouths to feed, right? You have Mike Evans, you had now Antonio Brown coming into the mix, Rob Gronkowski, so a lot of distribution of wealth there, but I think for this game with Antonio Brown out, you're going to see Chris Godwin force-fed here a bit. Next is going to be Aaron Rodgers. Listen, If I had to pick a quarterback in this game, Aaron Rodgers is going to have to sling the ball, especially as we talked about. The Bucs are pretty stout on the run. So if they're going to go ahead and win this game, the Green Bay Packers, they're going to need to sling the ball. And again, that's going to be that Rodgers and Devontae Adams connection. And then last, I have Leonard Fournette. Listen, I love Ronald Jones, but you know how Bruce Arians can be. He's going to ride the hot hand. I think both of these running backs are coming into play here, and I think that has a lot to do with their pricing. Again, $4,600 for Ronald Jones, $5,300 for Leonard Fournette. If you're looking to go a little bit cheap, a little bit contrarian, staying away from Aaron Jones, for example, in this game, those are going to be the two slots that you want to go to. Let's talk about the Buffalo Bills that are going to be at Kansas City Chiefs starting at 6:40 Eastern Time. Again, with the spread, we're looking at the Chiefs -3 with a point total of 53.5. With regards to injuries, on the Bills side, we have Vernon Butler, defensive tackle. He's going to be out with the questionable with the quad. And then Gabriel Davis, wide receiver, ankle, also questionable. Chiefs, we're going to have Willie Gay, linebacker, is going to be out. Brashad Breeland, cornerback, he has a concussion in shoulder. Rashad Fenton, cornerback, with a foot injury. Clyde Edwards-Helaire, hip, is questionable, but did get a report late today here that we're actually going to see him sprinkled in with Darrell Williams, so we'll see how much he can actually put out there today. And then also, lastly, Le'Veon Bell with the knee, Sammy Watkins with the calf are also both questionable. Probably going to stay away from those guys, but it is good to know, who's going to play, how many reps are they going to take, how often are they going to be on the field. So definitely be on the lookout for that as game time approaches for the last final injury list. So again, let's talk about matchups to exploit. The Bills side, what can you say? I mean, it's been a great season for the Bills coaching staff. They've completely transformed their offensive identity from a run-first team to becoming the third best passing team in the NFL. They've helped take Josh Allen, who had struggled at times the past few years here throwing the ball, to find the right mix of deep ball throws and to the underneath checkdowns. He's now transformed into arguably one of the best dual threat quarterbacks in the NFL. So great season by him on his part. For this game, I don't know if that offensive style is really going to work against the Kansas City Chiefs and be a great game plan. If the Bills try to get into a track meet with Patrick Mahomes and the Kansas City Chiefs, I think they'll almost definitely lose. You need to run the ball against this Chiefs defense. The Chiefs are the second worst DVOA against the run this season. They give up the 12th most running yards per attempt this season. Let's see, Kansas City's also surrendered the 9th most rushing yards, 3rd most receptions, most receiving yards, and the 10th most fantasy points to running backs this season. So what does that say to me? I think this fares well for Devin Singletary. He's received 84% of the snaps for the Buffalo Bills during the divisional round game against the Ravens, but he only had 10 touches. Singletary will have to run the ball more than Josh Allen if the Bills are going to have any shot at winning this game. I think on the Chiefs side, Patrick Mahomes, there was some concern that he may not play with the concussion that he had last week. He's gone through concussion protocol. He's going to be making the game for today. So, game plan is going to be business as usual for the Chiefs. When the Chiefs beat the Bills back in Week 6, again, ironically enough, the same week that the Bucs and the Packers last played, they did so by punishing the Bills' defense on the ground. Clyde Edwards-Helaire had his best game on the ground. He had 26 rushes for 161 yards. As a team, the Chiefs ran the ball 46 times for 245 yards and a touchdown, and they won the game 26-17. The Bills surrendered the 5th most rushing yards per attempt this season. They allowed the 13th most rush yards, 8th most rushing touchdowns, and the 12th most fantasy points to running backs all season. With the idea that CEH is going to be limited at the very least, I think this is a play here for Darrell Williams all day to become, the best running back play on the board across both games. The Bills also struggle, as you probably already know, against tight ends. And who do they face on the other side of the field? Probably the best tight end, non-arguably in the league, in Travis Kelce. With the Bills' struggles, as I mentioned, they've allowed the 2nd most targets, the most receptions, 2nd most receiving yards, 8th most fantasy points to tight ends this season. And then again, in that Week 6 matchup, Travis Kelce was targeted 7 times out of the 26 pass attempts that the Chiefs ran. Caught 5 of those targets, and 2 of them went for a touchdown. So I think, again, today, Mahomes to Kels combo is going to be a pretty deadly combo against the Bills and their lack of tight end defense. So who do I have again, just to summarize for the 5 best plays in this game? Again, if you probably haven't already figured it out, my best play is going to be Darrell Williams, 4,800 on DraftKings. I think he's going to have a great game, and when you talk for that price, a little bit of a contrarian play, he's going to be a nice go-to guy. Number 2, going again back to Travis Kelce. Pricey at 8,000, but you're paying for those points at the tight end spot. The issue that I always think about when you talk about tight ends in the fantasy football season is, you can play that Russian roulette with paying down, but the issue is if you have a guy like Travis Kelce go off, it's going to be very hard to make those points up elsewhere. So more often than not, I've come to the habit of paying up to the tight end, unless you have that great matchup where you want to take a punt play and play another tight end. Number 3 is going to be Josh Allen. Listen, 6,900, price is okay. They're not going to be able to win unless he's making plays, right? And that's not just, throwing the ball to guys like Stephon Diggs, to John Brown, who's now back and had a great game last week. They're going to need him on his feet too, right? Making plays with his legs. If they can't do that, I find it very hard to see how they're going to come out of Arrowhead with the win. Talking about Josh Allen, number 4, who's he throwing it to? We all know Stephon Diggs. Great year coming into Buffalo this year. He's been a catalyst for this offense completely. Him and Allen have been a great combo. And I think, again, if they're going to do anything this afternoon and this evening, they're going to need points and stability out of the wide receiver spot with Diggs. And then lastly, to round it off, Devin Singletary. Again, with the price line at 4,500 on DraftKings, I think he's a nice contrarian play. You're paying down at the position. So again, he's going to need to be an important cog if the Buffalo Bills are going to come out with that victory. All right, so that was a little bit of a breakdown of each game. As I mentioned, being that I am really heavily into the daily fantasy lineup builds, I wanted to give a breakdown position by position of the championship round on who I feel are going to be the best selections at those spots. Let's start with quarterback. Again, I think best spot probably is going to lie with Aaron Rodgers. And before I begin, I'm going to give you a best, a contrarian, a super contrarian tag on each of these, whether it's quarterback, tight end. There really isn't contrarian plays at these positions. When I say quarterback or tight end, Rodgers is the best play for me. He has the best matchup. Patrick Mahomes is recovering from a slight concussion. Listen, as I mentioned before, Rodgers was terrible against the Bucs in Week 6, but I strongly believe that had more to do with the Bucs defense rather than Rodgers himself. Again, cornerback Jamel Dean sat on a quick out to Devontae Adams, picked it off, took it to the house. Fellow quarterback Carlton Davis played a tremendous game that week, again, contesting pass after pass. That was great scouting and preparation by the Tampa Bay Bucs coaching staff, but I think the Packers are going to be ready this time. Again, specifically Rodgers, who knows that this is his time, right? He knows that his time at the top is winding down. Listen, they went out and drafted a quarterback last year, so he knows that the spotlight is on right now. The Rodgers to Devontae Adams connection, again, with only Carlton Davis now standing in their way. Listen, Davis has played really well early in the season, but as I mentioned earlier, he struggled down the stretch, surrendering the 14th most receptions, 10th most TD catches in all of football. This is going to be a feast matchup, the one that Rodgers is surely not to squander this time around. Contrarian pick, Josh Allen is going to be my go-to there. Again, at 6,900. We've identified that the Bills need to run the football to beat the Chiefs, but that doesn't necessarily mean by a running back. Allen is just as dangerous for the Chiefs on the ground this week as he is through the air. The great thing about Allen is that game flow really won't impact his fantasy production, the way that he may generate it, right? If the Bills get out to a lead and command it, it will certainly be due to Josh Allen making big plays with his arm, and likely to Stephon Diggs. And or John Brown. If the Bills get behind early, it'll force Allen to throw and push the ball more aggressively, and again, that's with his arm and his leg. I do think he's going to be popular, of course, but it is starting to look like he could be the third highest owned QB this week based on some of the ownership projections that I've been looking at, which if it's for us, that's just going to be crazy good. And then I think lastly, for my super contrarian play is going to have to be Tom Brady at 6,100. Again, as I mentioned, listen, nobody is super contrarian this week at the QB spot, but I do think Brady is going to definitely be the lowest owned QB of the week. The Bucs should run the hell out of the ball against the Green Bay this week, as that's their best path to victory. But if the game flow does go according to script, it will be up to Brady and, again, the plethora of great receivers to bring them back. If the Bucs are running well, we know that Brady will take away those rushing TDs at the goal line, as he did last week with a 3-yard TD run, or 3-yard TD pass to Mike Evans. So let's jump into running backs. With the running backs, again, what I like to do is kind of do an O-line, D-line, a matchup model, and I'll also do something similar for the cornerback, wide receiver matchups. But before we get to that, for the O-line and defensive line matchups, the best defensive line matchup that I have this week is going to be the Kansas City Chiefs versus the Buffalo Bills. Tampa Bay versus Green Bay is going to be number 2. And then number 3 is going to be Green Bay versus Tampa Bay Bucks. So there's going to be my top 3 based upon my model that I use. Great segue into that. My best play this week at the running back spot is going to be Darrell Williams. As I mentioned, with 2 games left on an NFL slate, you do have to take some major risks. And this is where I'm going to be kind of staking my flag at this running back spot. Again, what does that mean? This means that we're fading the best running back of the 4 remaining teams in Aaron Jones and finding another who is capable of outperforming him this week, at least in my opinion. So to put it bluntly, I am all in on Darrell Williams this week. And so we'll see. That's going to be the risk, and we'll see how we make out with that. Again, as I'm speaking to this, we did get reports that Clyde Edwards-Helaire will be sprinkled in and will be suiting up into the rotation, which would be actually the first time since he suffered his hip injury in Week 15. I do see him getting some run, but I do think, again, it's going to be Darrell Williams. How much? That remains to be seen. But, again, my strong belief is Andy Reid is not going to put an injured rookie running back in harm's way in the AFC Championship game. He has a long history of trusting the veteran running back, and more precisely, the running back who has been running the ball well and won't disrupt the rest of the offense. So who has that been? That has been Darrell Williams the past few weeks. If you also remember, too, CEH has already kicked out of goal line opportunities at failing at that job pretty early in the season. He did catch just 36 passes this season, despite playing 13 full games in 2020. Darrell Williams, who saw just 30% or more of snaps 3 times this season, has caught 18 passes. Last week, Williams did receive about 79% of the snaps, which again was the second most of any of the remaining running backs left in the playoffs. With Le'Veon Bell's knee swelling up and Patrick Mahomes coming back from that concussion, I think we can safely assume the Chiefs' game plan will consist of a heavy rushing attack. For my contrarian play, it's going to be Ronald Jones. Again, it's another risky running back proposition, but one that I think is going to be worth the payoff. He did screw over some DFS players, me in particular, in the wild card round. And I'm sure some folks are still going to be pretty upset about that with the recency bias. But again, swallowing my pride, I'm going to take the lumps if I have to. But again, I believe the payout will be hefty there if he does break off. He's practicing in full. Listen, he is about 90% over that quad injury based on what Coach Arians has said. So if anybody who actually watched last week's game against the Saints knows that Jones got loose on 3 big runs, 2 of which totaled 62 yards that were actually called back due to penalties. Leonard Fournette will likely see more snaps again this week, but if Jones gets going early, he could really rack up numbers against the defense that struggles to stop the run. Back in Week 6 against the Packers, Jones had one of his best games of his season and of his career. He rushed the ball 23 times, 113 yards, and 2 rushing touchdowns. He racked up 26.1 fantasy points in the process. So, again, I think, that's what we're hopefully looking for today. Maybe not 26 points, but I think for the price of the $4,600 on DraftKings, you're going to get your money back and maybe then some. As I did say, Fournette is projected to get run, and I actually think he's going to have a slightly higher ownership than Jones this week, which giving him the perfect same great matchup at a cheaper and lower owned price. And then lastly, super contrarian is going to be Devin Singletary. Listen, as I had noted before, he's the starting running back on the third best offense in the NFL this season, going up against the defense with the second worst DVOA against the run. You would think that Singletary would be much more popular this week, but actually, surprisingly, he isn't. I had been maybe sniffing around at the newly signed Devontae Foreman and even TJ Yeldon to see if either might challenge Singletary for touches this week, but I don't think they will. Yeldon played a few snaps last week, barely got in. I think this is Singletary's backfield, and again, it's a pass-heavy offense, so I think he's going to be the one you're going to have to stake your claim to. With it being his backfield, for better or worse, 84.2% of the snaps last week, as I mentioned, that's the most of any running back still left in the playoffs. And in fantasy, opportunity is priority number one, right? Who's getting the touches, who's on the field. So that's my defense of Devin Singletary for this week. If the Bills get out to a lead, they're going to run the ball more than usual. If they fall behind, they'll throw, and I think that provides him some opportunities as checkdowns. The Chiefs give up the fourth most targets, third most receptions, most receiving yards, and third most receiving touchdowns to running backs this season. So there is a good opportunity there. For the running back spot, I'll throw out a second super contrarian pick, and that's going to be Jamal Williams of the Packers at 4,400. And the thought process there is, listen, if I'm fading Aaron Jones, it makes sense then to either use Jamal Williams or A.J. Dillon. Unfortunately, both of these guys are banged up, which blurs the line a little bit. If both play, it'll be Williams who plays the complementary role to Aaron Jones. Can't speak today. Let me just take a sip of coffee. Complementary, there you go. Last week, Williams played 40% of the snaps, received 12 carries, just 2 less than Aaron Jones. So if the game flow is similar as Las Vegas actually seems to believe, I think we're actually going to see a pretty heavy workload for Williams in the second half. All right, let's just move on to wide receivers. Again, with my wide receivers and cornerbacks, I like to do a little matchup model. And as we go into further podcasts, I can break down how I go about some of these models just for a little bit of background. But for today's sake, just to go through the list, my number one matchup is going to be Sean Murphy-Bunting from the Bucs against Alan Lazard. Taron Johnson from the Bills against Tyreek Hill from the Chiefs. Shandon Sullivan from the Packers against Chris Godwin. L'Jarius Sneed for the Chiefs against Cole Beasley for the Bills. Travarius Ward from the Chiefs against Stefon Diggs from the Bills. And then lastly, Kevin King from the Packers against Tyler Johnson from the Buccaneers. And when I say my cornerback wide receiver matchup, that's specifically looking for the worst coverage cornerbacks out there in some of these games. So while some of those names aren't familiar, that's always kind of my first stance when I look at wide receivers is, what is that cornerback matchup? Where do they line on each side of the field? Are they shadowing them for the whole game? So while it's not as apparent this week, you'll probably notice a little bit more of that as we get into the 2021 fantasy football season when we break those down. So let's talk best. Probably no surprise here. Best is going to be Davante Adams. He's the absolute best wide receiver play this week, and thus he's hard to fade for whether you like it or not. We all know that Adams is a target hawk. He's been the primary weapon for Aaron Rodgers all season, and what will likely be an MVP year for Aaron. Adams locked horns with Jalen Ramsey last week and still managed 10 targets, 9 receptions, 66 yards, and a TD. With the Super Bowl on the line, this stat line is a baseline for Adams against the Bucs defense that gave up the second most targets, the most receptions, and the 9 most receiving yards to running backs this season. What can you say? Lock button. Don't even think twice about it. Number 2 is going to be Chris Godwin at 5,400 on DraftKings. Listen, here's the deal. Antonio Brown is out with a knee injury. Mike Evans is expected to be shadowed by what I would call probably the one, if not second best cornerback in all of football, in Jair Alexander. This leaves Godwin in the slot lined up against Shandon Sullivan most of the game, which is by far the most advantageous matchup for the Tampa Bay passing game. The game script is also quite favorable to more pass attempts for the Bucs, and Godwin has led the team in targets each of the last 2 games. I am sure he's going to be pretty popular, but he's not projected to be over 50%, which is a win in this tiny 2-game slate. For my contrarian pick, I'm going to have to go with John Brown from the Bills at 4,300. Stefon Diggs is a stud. We've already called that out. And Gabriel Davis has been a DFS darling over the course of this season with Brown out. So we are hoping that he's active on Sunday night, but that would leave us with John Brown as an overlooked wide receiver option for us in a positive game script. Music to my ears. Brown actually tied for the lead in targets and receptions last week with Diggs in a Bills victory against the Ravens. Brown will be facing a banged up and questionable Bashaud Breeland, who's already is at a disadvantage due to the lack of speed and Brown's big playability. And then finally, for my super contrarian plays, I'll throw out 2 at you here, or actually, let's say 3. My first is going to be Marquez Valdez-Scantling for the Packers at 3,900. We all know Devontae Adams is going to lead the Packers in targets and receptions, but we will need to identify which other receiver can make the splash play for the Green Bay offense. Last week, Lazard came in and had a great game and a touchdown, but I think MVS's big playability is going to be kind of where we want to spotlight, at least for this game. We used MVS against the Rams last week, generated 8 targets, but he only caught half of them for 33 yards. If he gets 8 targets again this week, he will almost certainly connect on a big play and a likely TD. I mean, I love that Allen Lazard is being talked up as both the pivot and complement to Adams this week. Again, based on last week's play. So I think MVS is going to be a little forgotten this week. And then, I guess for my final 2, primarily the first guy that I'll throw out there, but we'll throw in another. It's going to be Tyler Johnson from the Bucs at 3,000. I do have Scotty Miller in there as well, so you can choose both of those as a contrarian play in your wide receiver spot if you're trying to pay down. But I'm actually leaning towards Tyler Johnson. Again, Antonio Brown's going to be out, leaving that third wide receiver role open for the Bucs. Johnson, to me, has been the guy coming on down the stretch pretty strong. He made one of the best catches of the season on a poorly thrown ball by Tom Brady last week. Johnson played 27 snaps last week against the Saints, most of which, about 24, I think to my notes here, came after Antonio Brown went out of the game. And, I think it's going to be him playing on the outside against Kevin King, which is a great matchup for Johnson. The rookie out of Minnesota has the best combination of skill set, opportunity, game script, price, and ownership of any wide receiver this week. For Scotty Miller, I'll just say, Tom Brady has a nice connection with him from when Scotty has had an opportunity to play, mostly before pre-Antonio Brown. Has a little bit of a Julian Edelman feel with some of his routes that he's running. That's a little bit more of a pump play for me, but I can't argue it if you're, trying to pay up at some of the other spots on your lineups. All right, and then let's move on to tight end. So best tight end, I'll make this pretty short and sweet. It's Travis Kelce, again at 8,000. He's the best there is, the best there was, the best there ever will be at the tight end spot. A little Brett the Hitman Hart play there. The Bills' one weakness against the pass is the tight end position. They have given up the second most targets, the most receptions, the second most receiving yards, the 8th most fantasy points to tight ends this season. No matter how you slice it, they are very poor at the tight end spot. And what do you say about Kels? I mean, yes, he had a relatively quiet game against the Bills in Week 6. And when I say relatively quiet, he only had 7 targets, 5 of which were caught, 65 yards and 2 touchdowns. And right there, that's 23.5 fantasy points, a total that every other tight end combined may not be able to touch this week. So, again, along with Devontae, he's one of my lock button plays this week. If you are going to go contrarian at the tight end spot, I'm looking at Robert Tonyan from the Packers at 3,600. I think he's probably the second choice or second obvious choice at the tight end spot this week. I don't know how highly owned he's going to be this week. I'm really unsure on that. I think every single one of us should simply just plug in Kels and move along. But DFS players love nothing more than to get cute. I've fallen victim to it plenty of times, and there's a real chance that about 25% of players are probably going to do exactly that. My ceiling projection for Tanyan, even if I gave him a full share of a TD against the Bucks, still only gets him about 16 and a half points. For me, that isn't enough points, nor will it be contrarian enough to justify fading the big guy in Travis Kelce. And then last, my super contrarian play is going to be Cameron Brate, 30,000. This is where I would go if I was fading Kelce this week, which I'm not. Tampa's using Rob Gronkowski as the blocking TE on the majority of their snaps this postseason, while Brate has become the comfy blanket for quarterback Tom Brady. Brate has racked up 11 targets, 8 receptions, 130 yards in the Bucs' first 2 playoff games. He also had a TD call back 2 weeks ago, if people forget, against Washington, thanks to a holding penalty on Tristan Wirfs. So those are plays that you don't see, but they happen. So just kind of further adds to that super contrarian play if you want to go down that route. I will say the bump in snaps, the large usage numbers, the super low price, the low ownership is why he'd be my second best play at tight end this week. And then let's talk defense and special teams. The best this week is going to be the Green Bay Packers at 36. These are all good offenses left in the NFL playoffs, so there really isn't a slam dunk defense and special teams this week for us to cherry pick. I think the right move is to use either one of the NFC Championship game defenses, as there is just a much greater chance that either the Bucs or the Packers offense falls off the rails, and I want to stay away from the Chiefs and the Bills high potent offense. My choice would be the Packers since they're at home and have better playmakers on defense overall. Contrarian, as I mentioned, it would have to be the Tampa Bay Buccaneers at 2,700. The best game that the Tampa Bay defense had all season was in that Week 6 win against the Green Bay Packers. As I stated previously, I would remain in the NFC for my defense no matter how many lineups I'm doing. The Bucs defense put up 19 fantasy points in that first meeting, aided by a 32-yard interception return for a touchdown by Jamel Dean. In that game, the Bucs really beat up Aaron Jones, sacking him 5 times, 13 hits, and then intercepting him twice. And again, my eyes, sometimes a defense just knows what an opponent is doing, and it certainly appeared that way in the first matchup, so I'll be interested to see what comes of the second matchup. All right, so last, I'm just going to throw out probably my lock button plays this week based on what we've just discussed. So what I like to do is look at what we call like a core 4. I want to look at 4 players that I'm going to have in all my lineups no matter what. This is the foundation of your lineups and then allows you to build in some of those other plays as you need to. My core 4s are really, again, more specific to my cash lineup builds, but with more of a GPP tourney flavor this week. You're going to have to build multiple lineups here. So I'll throw a few of those core 4s at you and then give you which is probably going to be my best core 4 pick. Starting at my number 1 core 4 pick, I think, again, QB, we're going to go with Aaron Rodgers. Running back, Darrell Williams. Wide receiver, Chris Godwin. And then tight end, Travis Kelce. Another core 4 that I had is Josh Allen, Darrell Williams, Tyler Johnson, and Travis Kelce. Again, it's really how you guys want to play it. I think as I settle into my lineups here, the third that I was looking at is going to be a combination of, Aaron Rodgers, Devontae Adams, Ronald Jones, and then Stephon Diggs. I was able to pay a little bit down again with some of my running backs with Ronald Jones, Devin Singletary, which offered up the opportunity to be able to pay up at that wide receiver spot again for Adams, Diggs, and then even Kels at the tight end spot. That did require me to go down on my defense, and I paid all the way down with Tampa Bay. Again, we'll see how that goes. It's a little tricky to do, a 2-game slate. It's really luck of the draw here. So don't rake me over the coals here if you don't win much money this week based on some of my discussion. But I promise you, as we go into next season, I'll give you the blueprint to put some money in your pocket. So I just want to thank everyone for your time today. Good luck. I know the games have already started a little bit of a trial run here, but let me know your thoughts. As always, thanks for tuning in to the JLR daily fantasy sports and sports betting podcast, and be on the lookout for another episode coming from Joe Joselevich, Len Martin, and TJ Rowley. Everyone stay safe out there and make that money.